Move. Now. The word cracked through the cabin like a gunshot, sharp enough to make several heads snap up at once. A uniformed man stood in the aisle, broad shoulders squared, one hand braced against the overhead bin, as the aircraft trembled lightly beneath his boots. His jaw was clenched. His eyes were locked on the woman seated at the window in seat 1A. She did not look up. The plane was still on the ground, engines idling low, a deep mechanical breath humming through the fuselage. Outside, rain streaked the windows of the private terminal at Westchester County Airport, blurring the floodlights into pale halos. Inside the cabin, the air smelled faintly of leather and coffee that had gone cold. "I won't repeat myself," the pilot said, his voice controlled but vibrating with something darker. "You are in the wrong seat." Margaret Lewis rested her palm flat on the armrest. Her hand was steady. The skin was dark, the veins faint but visible, the nails short and unpainted. 63 years old. Calm enough to feel the tension before anyone else named it. She slowly turned her head and met his eyes. There was no fear in her face, no apology, just attention. Around them, the cabin held its breath. Margaret wore a charcoal cardigan, soft at the elbows, over a plain cream blouse. Sensible flats. No jewelry except a thin gold watch on her left wrist, old enough to have scratches that told a life of use. To the casual eye, she looked like someone's aunt, someone who brought potato salad to church picnics, someone who had learned long ago how to take up as little space as possible in places where power gathered loudly. But her eyes missed nothing. "I'm seated where my boarding pass assigned me," she said quietly. The pilot laughed once through his nose. It was not a friendly sound. "Ma'am, this aircraft operates under a different standard than commercial flights. Seat 1A is reserved." "Reserved for whom?" Margaret asked. A flicker crossed his face. Irritation. Calculation. He glanced back toward the forward galley, where a man in a tailored navy blazer stood half-turned away, pretending to study his phone while listening to every word. Thomas Grant. Silver hair, 60 years old. The kind of man who carried himself like the world had been arranged with him in mind. "For operational reasons," the pilot said, "you'll need to move to the rear cabin." The word rear landed heavy. Margaret leaned back slightly, the leather whispering beneath her. She inhaled slowly. She could hear her own breath, feel the vibration of the engines through the seat frame, the faint clink of glassware somewhere behind the galley curtain. She had flown hundreds of thousands of miles in her life. Commercial, military charters, test flights with engineers who spoke in equations and probabilities. She knew the difference between necessity and convenience. She also knew when a lie was being dressed in uniform. "Before I move," she said, "I'd like that reason documented on the manifest." The pilot's eyes hardened. "That won't be necessary." Across the aisle, a woman in her 40s, wearing a pressed Navy uniform, shifted her weight. Emily Parker, senior cabin attendant. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. Her fingers tightened around the tablet in her hands. She had seen this kind of moment before, the kind that slid off course quietly and then kept sliding because no one put their foot down early. "Captain," Emily said carefully, her voice low, professional. "Her name is on the list for 1A. The pilot did not look at her. "I said I'll handle it." Margaret watched the exchange with a stillness that unsettled them both. She noticed the way Emily's shoulders lifted with a shallow breath, the way Thomas Grant finally looked up from his phone, impatience creasing his brow, as if the delay itself were an insult. "This is getting ridiculous," Grant said, loud enough for the cabin to hear. "We're all tired. Let's just fix it." Fix it. As if people were objects that could be slid into place. Margaret turned slightly, enough to see him clearly now. He avoided her eyes. She recognized that, too. "I'm not refusing to cooperate," she said, her voice even. I'm asking for transparency. The pilot leaned closer. She could smell the faint trace of mint on his breath, the starch in his uniform. Authority, pressed and polished. Ma'am, if you delay this flight any further, I'll be forced to note non-compliance. There it was, the first step. The word that opened doors to other words. Disruptive, uncooperative, unsafe. A few rows back, someone cleared their throat. Another passenger shifted in their seat. The cabin was small, intimate. There was nowhere for the tension to go. Margaret held the pilot's gaze. In his eyes, she saw certainty, the kind that came from years of being obeyed, from believing the machine beneath his feet belonged to him because he knew how to operate it. She had seen that look in boardrooms and courtrooms, in men who mistook access for ownership. All right, she said. The word landed softly, almost anticlimactic. She unfastened her seatbelt with a quiet click, stood slowly, giving no one the satisfaction of haste. As she reached for her bag, Emily's eyes flicked to hers, searching for something. Anger, hurt, a plea. Margaret gave her a small nod. Reassurance, not surrender. I'll move, Margaret said. For now. The pilot straightened, relief flashing across his face like a brief victory. Thank you. Emily, show her to the aft cabin. Emily hesitated, then gestured down the aisle. This way, Miss Lewis. As Margaret walked past Thomas Grant, he stepped into seat 1A without a word, exhaling as if reclaiming something rightfully his. He did not look at her. He did not have to. The system had already spoken for him. Margaret took her new seat near the rear, closer to the lavatory, the hum of machinery louder there, the space tighter. She sat, smoothed her cardigan, and buckled in. Her heart rate had not changed. Not yet. From her bag, she took out a slim black notebook, worn at the corners. She opened it to a blank page and wrote 3 things in careful block letters. Time, names, decision. Then she closed the notebook and rested her hands on top of it. Outside, the engine spooled higher, a rising whine that vibrated through bone and steel. Inside the cockpit, the pilot ran through his checklist, satisfied that order had been restored. No one noticed the message that had already been sent from Margaret's phone before she stood up. No subject line, no emotion, just a single sentence addressed to a legal team that answered only to ownership. Observing deviation from stated cabin protocol. NSX 741. Please monitor. The plane began to taxi, and somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the rain, beneath the quiet confidence of men who thought the sky answered to them, something irreversible had already shifted. The seatbelt sign chimed as the aircraft turned onto the runway, a clean metallic sound that cut through the low murmur of the cabin. The engines rose from a restrained hum to a deeper, hungrier roar, vibrating through the floor and into Margaret Lewis's spine. She felt it the way she always did, not as excitement, not as fear, but as information, speed, weight, intention. Across the aisle, a man cleared his throat and folded his newspaper too carefully. 2 rows ahead, someone reached up to adjust an air vent that was already open. No one spoke. People sensed when something had gone wrong, even if they didn't yet have the words for it. Margaret kept her gaze forward. The narrow aisle reflected faintly in the polished trim, a warped mirror of uniforms and seats and restrained impatience. She could still see seat 1A if she angled her head slightly. Thomas Grant had already settled in, one arm stretched possessively across the armrest, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in a low, irritated voice. Yeah, minor issue. Handled, he said, and smiled at nothing. Handled. Margaret closed her eyes for half a second as the plane surged forward, acceleration pressing her back into the seat. She counted the seconds the way she always did. 1, 2, 3. The nose lifted, gravity shifted, the runway fell away, the climb smoothed out, the cabin exhaled. Emily Parker moved methodically through the aisle, checking seatbelts, her face composed but pale around the mouth. When she reached Margaret's row, she paused a fraction longer than necessary. "Are you all right, Miss Lewis?" she asked quietly. Margaret opened her eyes and met hers. "I am," she said. "Are you?" Emily's lips pressed together. "I'll be fine." That was not an answer, but it was the only one Emily could afford to give. As Emily moved on, Margaret noticed the way her shoulders remained tight, the way she avoided looking toward the front of the cabin. Margaret had spent decades reading rooms like this. Corporate negotiations, emergency hearings, closed-door meetings where careers ended with a cough and a signature. The details were always the tell. Not the shouting, not the threats. The pauses. The choices people made when they thought no one was watching. The plane leveled off, the engines settling into a steady rhythm. Somewhere near the galley, glass clinked softly. The smell of warmed metal and recycled air mixed with the faint sweetness of catering trays being unsealed. Margaret reached into her bag and removed her phone. Not the one most people noticed. The other one. Matte black. No logo. She unlocked it with a practiced motion and opened a secure message thread. There was no reply yet. That was expected. Systems took time. People took longer. She typed another line, brief and precise, then locked the screen and returned the phone to her bag. 2 rows forward, Emily stopped short. "Sir," she said, her voice professional, edged now with caution. "I'm going to need you to remain seated while the cabin finishes service." "I'm seated," Thomas Grant said, though he was half-turned in his chair, one knee already angled into the aisle. He held a glass of amber liquid, the ice melting too quickly. "Relax," the captain has asked. "The captain and I go way back," Grant interrupted, smiling without warmth. "You can tell him I'm fine." Margaret watched the exchange from behind lowered lashes. Grant's smile was loose now, his movements slightly exaggerated. He had the careless confidence of a man who had never been told no, in a way that stuck. Emily glanced toward the cockpit, then back at Grant. "Sir, please." Grant leaned closer. "You know, you should smile more," he said softly. "People listen better when you smile." Emily stiffened. "Please sit back." The words were correct. The tone was controlled. But her eyes flicked once, quickly, down the aisle. Margaret stood. The movement was subtle but decisive, the soft thump of her shoes against the floor cutting through the ambient noise. Conversations paused. Grant turned, startled, irritation flashing across his face. "Sir," Margaret said, her voice calm, carrying without effort. "You're interfering with crew instructions." Grant blinked. "Excuse me?" "The sign is on. She asked you to sit," Margaret continued. "You should sit." For a moment, no one breathed. Grant's expression shifted, disbelief curdling into offense. "Who do you think you are?" Margaret held his gaze. "Someone who doesn't need to raise her voice to be heard." Emily's breath caught audibly. "Ms. Lewis," Grant laughed, loud and sharp. "This is unbelievable. First you steal my seat, now you're policing me." Margaret's eyes flicked briefly to Emily. "I'll take responsibility for my words. That was the wrong thing to say." The cockpit door opened with a controlled hiss. The pilot stepped out, posture rigid, his presence filling the narrow space instantly. He took in the scene in a single sweep. Grant standing, Emily pale, Margaret upright, composed. "What's going on?" he demanded. "She's harassing me," Grant said immediately, pointing his glass. "Causing a disturbance." Margaret did not speak. She did not need to. The pilot's gaze settled on her. "Ms. Lewis, sit down." "She was enforcing your instructions," Margaret said evenly. The pilot's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for your help." A beat, a subtle one. Emily shifted, opening her mouth. "I can explain," she said. "I've got it," the pilot snapped. Margaret studied his face, the way his eyes avoided Emily's, the way he leaned slightly toward Grant, as if proximity itself were proof. "This is escalating," the pilot said, his voice clipped. "Miss Lewis, you are interfering with crew operations." Margaret felt it then, the moment sliding past the point of return. She recognized it the way one recognizes the sound of ice cracking beneath weight. "I am standing in the aisle," she said. "That's all." "Sit down," the pilot repeated. "Now." Margaret looked at Emily. Emily's eyes were wide, wet but steady. There was a question there, a plea. "Don't let this get worse." Margaret sat. The pilot exhaled sharply, turning back toward Grant. "Sir, please return to your seat." Grant smirked and complied, lifting his glass in a mock salute. "See? All good." The pilot lingered a moment longer, his gaze returning to Margaret. Something unreadable flickered there. Suspicion. Resentment. The sense of being challenged in front of witnesses. He went back into the cockpit. The door sealed shut. The cabin resumed its shallow breathing. Emily knelt beside Margaret's seat, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." Margaret shook her head. "You followed procedure." Emily swallowed. "I filed a report." Margaret's eyes softened, just a fraction. "Good." Emily hesitated. "They're going to say you caused it." Margaret looked forward again, her expression serene. "Then they'll have to explain it." Minutes passed. The plane cut through a bank of cloud, the light shifting from grey to pale gold. Grant laughed too loudly at something on his phone. A different attendant avoided eye contact as she passed. Margaret rested her hands on her notebook, feeling the vibration of the aircraft through her palms. The climb had been smooth. The turbulence was still ahead. In the cockpit, the pilot stared at his instruments longer than necessary, replaying the scene with a tightening knot in his chest. He told himself he had done the right thing. He told himself control mattered more than courtesy. He did not notice the timestamp already logged in the system, under his name. At 35,000 feet, the illusion of altitude did what it always did. It made people forget that gravity never stopped working. The first sign of trouble was not a voice or a movement. It was silence. At cruising altitude, the aircraft usually settled into a rhythm that lulled people into distraction. Screens flickered, pages turned, ice clinked. But now the cabin felt tight, as if the air itself had drawn inward. Margaret Lewis noticed it immediately. She always did. Silence like this was never empty. It was loaded. Thomas Grant had stopped talking. His phone lay face down on the tray table, the screen dark. The glass beside it was empty, a faint ring of condensation marking where it had been. He stared out the window without really seeing anything, jaw working as if chewing on a thought he did not like. Emily Parker moved more slowly now, deliberate, every step measured. When she reached the galley, she paused, pressing one hand lightly to the counter as the aircraft trembled through a mild pocket of turbulence. She checked the cabin again, her eyes scanning faces the way a lifeguard scans water. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Whitmore loosened his shoulders and told himself to relax. He had handled worse. He had handled real problems. Mechanical alerts, weather diversions, unruly passengers who knew exactly how far they could push before crossing a line. This was nothing. Just a woman who did not know her place and a guest who expected better service. Still, he keyed the intercom and spoke with measured authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign remains on for the moment. Please remain seated." Margaret listened to his voice and heard the strain beneath it, the slight tightness around the edges, like a knot pulled too hard. She imagined him in the cockpit, hands steady, thoughts less so. Authority had a way of cracking when it felt questioned. She reached into her bag again, slower this time, aware of eyes on her. Not alarmed eyes, curious ones. She removed her notebook and opened it to the page she had started earlier. Beneath the 3 block letters, she added another line. Crew response under pressure. She capped her pen and closed the book. A sudden jolt rocked the cabin. Not severe, but sharp enough to draw gasps. Overhead bins rattled. A soft chime sounded as the seatbelt sign flickered, then steadied. Grant cursed under his breath. Jesus. Emily's voice came over the cabin, calm but firmer now. "Please remain seated. Turbulence is expected." Grant did not listen. He pushed himself up, one hand gripping the seat back in front of him, as the plane shuddered again. "I need water," he said loudly. "Now!" "Sir," Emily called from the galley, "please sit down." Grant staggered a step into the aisle, his balance off, his patience gone. "I said I need water." Margaret felt her pulse change. Not faster, sharper. She did not move yet. She watched Emily strap herself into the jump seat, following protocol, her fingers moving with trained precision, despite the tension in her face. "Sir, I can't leave my seat right now," Emily said. "It's not safe." Grant laughed, a sloppy sound. "This is ridiculous. You people make everything a problem." He took another step forward. The plane dipped again, harder this time, the floor tilting beneath them. Grant grabbed the galley counter, knocking a tray loose. It clattered to the floor, silverware skittering. "Sit down," Emily said, louder now. Margaret stood. The movement was instinctive, controlled. She stepped into the aisle, placing herself between Grant and Emily, her stance wide enough to steady herself against the sway of the aircraft. Her voice cut through the noise, low and unmistakably firm. "Enough!" Grant blinked at her, his face flushing. "You again." "You are endangering the crew," Margaret said. "Return to your seat." Grant sneered. "You don't tell me what to do." Behind them, the cockpit door opened. Captain Whitmore emerged quickly, his expression already set. He had seen the scene on the monitor. He had made his decision before his boots hit the floor. "What is going on?" he barked. "She won't leave me alone," Grant said, pointing. "She keeps provoking me." "That's not what's happening," Emily said, her voice shaking now, despite her effort to control it. "Sir, he stood up during turbulence. I asked him to sit." Whitmore did not look at her. His eyes were on Margaret. "You," he said, "back to your seat, immediately." Margaret held his gaze. "He is violating safety instructions. I am the one responsible for safety on this aircraft," Whitmore snapped. "And right now, you are the problem." The words landed heavy. Somewhere in the cabin, someone whispered. Another passenger shifted, pulling their seatbelt tighter. Grant smiled, emboldened. Margaret felt the full weight of the moment settle. Not fear, clarity. This was no longer about a seat or a misunderstanding. This was about power choosing its target. "Captain," she said evenly, "I am asking you to address the correct risk." Whitmore stepped closer, invading her space. His voice dropped, hard and cold. "Sit down, or I will take action." Emily unbuckled herself halfway, panic flashing across her face. "Captain, please!" "Stay out of this," Whitmore barked. The plane lurched violently, throwing Margaret slightly off balance. Grant stumbled too, grabbing at her shoulder for support. "Don't touch me," Margaret said sharply. "That's it," Whitmore said. His hand went to the emergency kit mounted on the bulkhead. Time slowed. Margaret saw Emily's face drain of color, saw Grant's grin falter as the reality of escalation set in. She saw, with absolute certainty, the line Whitmore was about to cross. "Captain," Margaret said, her voice calm to the point of eeriness. "This is a mistake." Whitmore pulled out the restraint cuffs, the plastic gleaming under the cabin lights. "Turn around." Several passengers gasped. Emily stood fully now, ignoring protocol, her voice breaking. "You can't do this. She hasn't done anything." Whitmore did not hesitate. Margaret did not resist. She allowed him to guide her back into the jump seat, her movements controlled, her face composed. As the cuffs tightened around her wrists, biting into skin that had known decades of work and consequence, she met Whitmore's eyes. "You will regret this," she said quietly. Whitmore looked away. The cuffs snapped closed. Final. Recorded. He secured her into the seat with a practiced motion, breath hard, jaw set. Grant watched from his seat, unsettled now, the smile gone from his face. The cockpit door slammed shut. The cabin was silent again, but now it was a different kind of silence. Heavy. Horrified. Emily sank back into her jump seat, tears streaming unchecked. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Margaret leaned her head back, the hum of the aircraft vibrating through her skull. Her wrists burned, her shoulders ached, but her mind was razor clear. She turned her head slightly toward Emily. "Do not apologize," she said softly. "You did your job." Emily shook her head. "They're going to arrest you." Margaret's lips curved into something that was not a smile. "No," she said. "They're going to meet me." In the cockpit, Whitmore forced his breathing to slow, hands gripping the controls harder than necessary. He told himself this was procedure. He told himself he had restored order. He did not know that the cabin log had already been transmitted. He did not know that ownership records were being pulled, names cross-checked, calls placed. At 35,000 feet, the plane flew on, sealed and speeding through darkening sky, and the story it was carrying had just crossed the point where it could no longer be controlled. The restraints began to hurt after the first 10 minutes. Not sharply, not yet. It was a slow, insistent pressure, plastic biting into skin that had learned patience long before it learned pain. Margaret Lewis measured it the way she measured everything else, cataloguing sensation without letting it take over. The hum of the engines, the faint whistle of air through the vents, the smell of coffee turning stale somewhere beyond the galley. Emily Parker sat strapped into the jump seat opposite her, hands folded too tightly in her lap. She had stopped crying, but her eyes were rimmed red, blinking too often. Every few seconds she looked at Margaret's wrists, then away, as if the sight alone accused her. "I filed another report," Emily whispered, barely moving her lips. "Captain override, passenger restraint, time-stamped." Margaret inclined her head. "Good. They're going to say you forced his hand." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "They can say whatever they like. Records don't argue." The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, sharper than before. The fuselage groaned softly, a living thing under stress. Somewhere overhead, a bin rattled, then settled. From the front of the cabin came laughter. Not loud, controlled. Thomas Grant's voice, buoyed by alcohol and relief. He was talking again, confidence returning now that the inconvenience had been neutralized. Margaret could picture him without seeing him. Reclined, glass refilled, story already rewriting itself in his head. Across the aisle, a man in his 70s stared straight ahead, knuckles white against his armrests. His wife leaned toward him and murmured something Margaret could not hear. Fear, maybe, or recognition. People her age knew what it meant when authority decided you were expendable. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Whitmore ran his checklist with mechanical precision. Altitude stable. Heading locked. Weather marginal but manageable. His hands moved automatically, but his thoughts did not. He replayed the moment again. The way she had looked at him. Calm. Unafraid. Not defiant in the way he understood defiance, but something worse. Certain. He told himself she had challenged him in front of passengers. He told himself that order had to be maintained, that you could not let one person undermine command or the whole structure collapsed. Still, he did not log the incident himself. He let the system do it. Back in the cabin, Emily's radio crackled softly at her shoulder. She flinched, then pressed it to her ear. "Yes," she murmured. "Understood." She looked at Margaret, hesitated. "The captain wants me to ask if you require medical assistance." Margaret almost smiled. Almost. "No." Emily nodded. "We're about 2 hours from initial descent?" Margaret exhaled slowly. Time was tightening now. Systems were moving. Not quickly, never quickly, but steadily. She shifted her wrists slightly, enough to test circulation. The cuffs were tight, but not cutting off blood. That detail mattered. It told her something about Whitmore. Careless, but not thorough. Confident that escalation alone would be enough. The lights in the cabin dimmed a notch. Outside the windows, the sky had deepened into a dark, endless blue. Somewhere far below, the Atlantic rolled, unseen and indifferent. Margaret let her head rest against the seatback. She thought of the first company she had bought outright decades earlier. A small manufacturing firm in Ohio that everyone said was dying. She had walked the factory floor herself, listened to men who had not been listened to in years. She had learned then that power revealed itself fastest when people thought they were alone with it. The intercom chimed. "Lady and gentlemen," Whitmore's voice came through, controlled, formal. "We'll be beginning our descent in approximately 90 minutes. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions." There was a pause, a fraction too long. "And for everyone's safety," he added, "we ask that passengers refrain from unnecessary movement." Margaret opened her eyes. The words were meant for her. A final assertion, a reminder of who, for now, held the microphone. Emily swallowed. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, as if the word itself could undo physics. Margaret turned her head slightly. "Emily," she said quietly, "when this is over, you will be asked what you saw." Emily nodded, breath shaky. "Tell the truth," Margaret said, "even if your voice shakes." Emily's jaw set. "I will." The plane shuddered again, harder this time. A ripple of unease passed through the cabin. Grant's laughter cut off abruptly. "What the hell was that?" he snapped. Emily keyed her mic. "Please remain seated. Turbulence." Grant ignored her. He leaned into the aisle, squinting back toward Margaret. "You enjoying this?" he sneered. "Your little performance." Margaret did not look at him. Grant scoffed. "Figures." He turned away, muttering, but his hands trembled as he set his glass down. He had noticed the looks now, the quiet judgment, the way the cabin no longer felt aligned with him. In the cockpit, Whitmore adjusted course slightly, jaw tight. He did not like turbulence, not because it was dangerous, but because it reminded him that there were forces he could not command. A soft chime sounded in Margaret's bag. Emily noticed. Her eyes widened. "Is that?" "Nothing you need to worry about," Margaret said. Emily hesitated, then reached over and discreetly shifted Margaret's bag closer to her, blocking it from view of the aisle. A small act, a human one. Margaret met her eyes. Gratitude passed between them, brief and unspoken. She leaned her head back again, listening to the plane, feeling its rhythm. The tension had not broken. It had sharpened. Somewhere ahead, decisions were being made by people who had not been in the cabin. People who looked at logs and timestamps and patterns. People who understood that authority without accountability always left a trail. Margaret closed her eyes and counted the seconds again. Not because she was afraid, because she was waiting. The descent began earlier than scheduled. Margaret felt it before the announcement, the subtle change in pitch, the way the floor seemed to tilt just enough to register in muscle memory. The aircraft eased downward through layered cloud, the cabin lights adjusting automatically, dimming and brightening in slow, artificial dawns. Around her, people shifted, tension tightening like a drawn wire. Emily Parker checked her watch, then the overhead panel, then the cabin again. Her movements were precise now, sharper than before. Something had changed, not visibly, but enough. The intercom chimed. "Lady and gentlemen," Captain Whitmore's voice said, clipped, slightly too formal. "We've received updated instructions from air traffic control. We'll be beginning our final descent sooner than anticipated. Please remain seated." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Confusion. Questions swallowed before they could be spoken. Margaret opened her eyes. She knew that tone. She had heard it in earnings calls moments before bad news broke, in courtrooms when judges already had their ruling. The voice of someone trying to sound in control while the ground shifted beneath them. Thomas Grant leaned into the aisle again, irritation sharp. "What instructions?" Emily raised a hand. "Sir, please remain seated." Grant scoffed. "This flight keeps getting better." He glanced back toward Margaret, then looked away quickly, as if the sight unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Margaret felt the restraints again, the plastic warm now from her skin. She adjusted her shoulders slightly, easing the pressure. Her breathing remained slow, measured. She had learned long ago that panic wasted oxygen and attention. Emily leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "They moved us to a remote stand." Margaret turned her head just enough. "Did they say why?" Emily shook her head. "No, but that's not standard for this route." Margaret nodded once. "Thank you." Emily hesitated. "There's something else." Margaret waited. "The captain asked for law enforcement on arrival," Emily whispered. "He said it was for security." Margaret's lips pressed together. Not in fear, in acknowledgement. "All right," she said. Emily's eyes searched her face, desperate now for a reaction she could understand. "Aren't you worried?" Margaret met her gaze fully. "I would be," she said softly, "if I hadn't already asked them to come." Emily's breath caught. "You did what?" Margaret said nothing more. There was no need. Understanding arrived slowly, dawning across Emily's face like light breaking through cloud. The plane dipped again, steeper now. Outside the window, grey gave way to darker grey, rain streaking the glass in heavy lines. London waited below, unseen and impatient. In the cockpit, Whitmore's knuckles were white on the controls. He had not planned this part. The message from air traffic control had come through with unusual phrasing. Direct, non-negotiable. Remote stand assigned. Authorities notified. No further explanation. He had asked for confirmation. He had not liked the silence that followed. "Captain," the first officer said carefully, eyes flicking between instruments and the dark windshield. "This feels procedural." Whitmore did not respond. Procedural meant records. It meant oversight. It meant questions asked by people who did not care how important your passenger was, or how inconvenient the timing felt. It meant things got written down. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud, vibrating through the cabin. A woman near the window clasped her husband's hand. Someone whispered a prayer. Margaret felt the plane align, the subtle correction as the runway came into view. She focused on the sensation, grounding herself in physics. Weight, speed, contact. The wheels touched down hard, the sound loud and final, rubber screaming against wet tarmac. The cabin lurched forward as reverse thrust engaged, engines roaring, deceleration pressing Margaret against her restraints. Grant cursed loudly. A few passengers gasped. The plane slowed, turned, began its long taxi. Margaret craned her neck slightly, just enough to see past the aisle, toward the window ahead. Floodlights glared through the rain. Shapes moved beyond the glass. Vehicles. More than usual. Emily followed her gaze. Her face went pale. On the tarmac, dark silhouettes waited. 2 marked cars. Then more. Black SUVs with engines idling. Men standing under umbrellas, motionless despite the rain. "That's not normal," Emily whispered. Margaret closed her eyes again. Not in relief, in preparation. The plane came to a stop. The engines powered down, the sudden quiet almost deafening. The seatbelt sign remained lit. In the cockpit, Whitmore sat frozen for a heartbeat too long. Then he stood, straightening his uniform, smoothing it as if appearance alone could restore order. "Stay here," he told the first officer. His voice lacked its earlier edge. He stepped into the cabin. The door opened with a hiss, cold, damp air rushing in, carrying the smell of rain and jet fuel. Whitmore descended the stairs with forced confidence. No one greeted him. The men waiting did not step forward. They did not smile. They did not ask questions. One of them looked past Whitmore, directly into the cabin. "Is she still restrained?" the man asked. Whitmore's stomach dropped. "Yes," he said quickly. "She's disruptive, caused a—" "That won't be necessary anymore," the man said calmly. "Please step aside." 2 officers moved past him without waiting for permission. Inside the cabin, passengers craned their necks. Grant sat rigid, his earlier bravado gone, hands clasped tightly together. The officers approached the jump seat. Margaret looked up. "Ms. Lewis," one of them said, his tone respectful, almost gentle. "We're here to assist you." Emily let out a sob she had been holding back for hours. The officer cut the restraints cleanly. Plastic fell away. Margaret rolled her wrists slowly, flexing fingers gone stiff. Whitmore stood at the top of the stairs, rain soaking his cap, his face draining of color. "What is this?" he demanded. "You're making a mistake." Margaret rose. She stood without haste, straightening her cardigan, meeting his eyes at last. The cabin watched, breathless. "Captain Whitmore," she said evenly, "you are no longer in charge of this situation." Whitmore laughed, brittle. "You don't have the authority." A man stepped forward from the group outside, closing his umbrella. His suit was dark, impeccably tailored, his expression unreadable. "She does," he said. He turned to Margaret. "Ms. Lewis?" Margaret nodded. "Thank you for coming." The man faced Whitmore again. "For the record," he said, "Margaret Lewis is the principal owner of this aircraft and the controlling shareholder of North Star Executive Aviation. As of yesterday morning." The words hit the cabin like a physical force. Grant's mouth fell open. Whitmore staggered back a step, disbelief flashing into panic. "That's impossible!" Margaret stepped closer, her voice carrying, calm and absolute. "You ordered the owner of this plane out of her seat. You restrained her. You documented it. Every decision you made was logged." She paused, letting it sink in. And you did it without ever asking who I was. Silence. Rain hammered the fuselage. Cameras appeared in hands. A passenger whispered, "Oh my God." Whitmore opened his mouth, then closed it. His authority had nowhere left to land. Margaret turned slightly, addressing the cabin. "I apologize for the distress this caused," she said. "This will be addressed." Her gaze returned to Whitmore, steady and unyielding. "This is not how power is meant to be used," she said quietly. "And it will not be how it is used again." The officers stepped forward. Outside, London waited, grey and unforgiving. And the plane, finally still, had delivered its truth. The cabin did not erupt. It didn't gasp loudly or break into chaos the way movies suggested moments like this should. Instead, it went unnervingly still, as if everyone had instinctively understood that sound itself would be inappropriate now. Margaret Lewis remained standing in the aisle, hands free at last, wrists marked red where the restraints had been. She flexed her fingers once more, slowly, deliberately, not to soothe the pain, but to confirm sensation. Around her, passengers avoided her eyes, not out of disrespect, but out of the kind of awe that made people suddenly aware of their own smallness. Captain Whitmore stood frozen near the door, rainwater dripping from the brim of his cap onto the carpet, darkening it in uneven spots. His mouth opened, then closed. He tried again. "There has to be some mistake," he said, his voice thinner now, stripped of command. "Ownership changes don't happen like this, not overnight." "They do," Margaret replied, "when the paperwork is finalized and the money clears." She turned slightly toward the man in the dark suit who had identified her. He handed her a slim folder without ceremony. Inside were copies of filings, signatures, timestamps. Boring documents, unimpressive at a glance. The kind of paperwork that quietly moved industries while everyone else slept. Margaret did not open the folder. She didn't need to. She had reviewed every page herself days ago. "Captain," the man said, his voice firm but controlled. "You are being relieved of duty pending investigation. Please step aside." Whitmore's eyes flicked toward the cockpit, then back to the cabin. He seemed suddenly aware of every witness, every phone now raised, discreet but unmistakable. He straightened reflexively, a muscle memory honed over decades. "I demand to speak to company leadership," he said. Margaret met his gaze. "You are." The words were not raised. They did not need to be. Thomas Grant stood abruptly, knocking his knee against the tray table. "Hold on," he said, his voice cracking. "This is insane. You can't just... I'm a client. I fly this route all the time." Margaret turned her head toward him for the first time since landing. Her expression did not harden. That was what unsettled him most. "Mr. Grant," she said, "your status as a client does not excuse your behavior on this flight." Grant scoffed weakly. "Behavior? I didn't do anything." Emily Parker spoke before she could stop herself. Her voice shook, but it carried. "You ignored crew instructions. You stood during turbulence. You made inappropriate comments. I reported it." Grant stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You wouldn't." "I did," Emily said. "Twice." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Margaret nodded once, acknowledging Emily without spectacle. Then she turned back to the suited man. "Please ensure the crew logs are preserved. All of them." "They already are," he said. Outside, more personnel had gathered. Airport operations, legal representatives. 2 uniformed officers stood just beyond the stairs, their posture attentive but non-aggressive. This was not an arrest scene. It was something colder, administrative, irrevocable. Whitmore's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining out of him as reality settled. I was maintaining order, he muttered. Margaret studied him, not with anger, with something closer to disappointment. Order without fairness is just obedience enforced, she said. You weren't maintaining safety, you were protecting convenience. Whitmore swallowed. She challenged me. Margaret tilted her head. You mistook being questioned for being threatened. The words landed quietly, but they cut. She turned back toward the cabin, addressing everyone now. You will be allowed to disembark shortly. There will be statements taken. Transportation will be arranged. I regret that your journey ended this way. No one complained. No one objected. Emily unbuckled herself and stood, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She looked smaller without the jump seat framing her, but her spine was straight. Ms. Lewis, she said softly. Thank you. Margaret placed a hand briefly on Emily's arm, a human gesture, grounding. You did what your training asked of you, she said. That matters. Emily nodded, tears spilling freely now. Grant backed toward his seat, as if hoping invisibility might return if he moved slowly enough. It did not. Mr. Grant, the suited man said, we'll need you to remain for questioning. Grant's face went pale. This is outrageous. Margaret's voice was calm. No, she said. This is accountability. Whitmore was escorted down the stairs, his cap removed, his radio taken gently but firmly. He did not look back. Margaret watched him go, not with satisfaction, but with a heavy understanding. She had seen this ending many times. Men who believed authority was a personal possession rarely prepared for the moment it was taken away. As the cabin began to empty, Margaret finally allowed herself to sit again, this time by choice. The seat creaked softly beneath her. The adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind a dull ache in her wrists and shoulders. She rolled them carefully. The suited man approached once more. We'll need a formal statement. You'll have it, Margaret said. Tomorrow. He nodded, of course. Outside, the rain lightened, the sound softening from a drumbeat to a whisper. Dawn edged into the sky, thin and grey. Margaret looked out the window at the wing, still wet, still gleaming under the lights. A machine built on trust, on rules followed without exception, on the understanding that no one, no matter how confident, flew alone. She closed her eyes briefly. The flight was over. The reckoning was just beginning. Morning arrived without ceremony. London woke under a low, grey sky, the kind that flattened sound and slowed time. In a quiet conference room overlooking the airfield, Margaret Lewis sat at the head of a long table, hands folded, a porcelain cup of untouched tea cooling beside her. Through the glass wall, planes taxied and lifted, indifferent to the night that had just rearranged several lives. Across from her, files lay open. Crew logs, cabin reports, time-stamped audio transcripts. The story no longer belonged to memory. It belonged to records. Emily Parker sat 3 chairs down, shoulders squared inside a borrowed blazer, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but steady. She had not slept. Neither had most of them. Sleep was what came after truth had settled. A man from compliance cleared his throat. We've completed the preliminary review, he said. Based on crew testimony, cockpit recordings, and cabin logs, Captain Whitmore is formally suspended pending license review by the Aviation Authority. Margaret nodded once. And Thomas Grant, the man continued, has been placed on a temporary no-fly restriction while we assess passenger conduct violations. Emily's fingers tightened slightly in her lap. Margaret noticed. What about the crew? Margaret asked. The man hesitated. They followed protocol once escalation occurred. Margaret's gaze shifted to Emily. Not once, she said. Twice. The man corrected himself. Yes, twice. Outside, an aircraft lifted into the sky, its engines fading quickly into the overcast. Margaret followed it with her eyes, then looked back at the table. Protocol is not just a checklist, she said. It's a culture. If the system rewards silence over judgment, it will fail again. No one argued. The meeting adjourned quietly. Chairs slid back. Papers were gathered. People left with careful steps, aware that history was being written in margins and footnotes. Emily remained seated. Margaret waited. I've been thinking, Emily said finally, her voice low. About last night. About how close it came to going further. Margaret inclined her head. It did go further. Emily swallowed. If you hadn't, if you weren't who you are, Margaret held her gaze. Then this room would still exist, she said. The documents would still exist. Only the outcome would change. Emily frowned. That doesn't seem right. It isn't, Margaret agreed. A silence settled between them. Not heavy, reflective. What happens now? Emily asked. Margaret stood, smoothing her jacket. Now we decide what kind of company this is going to be. Later that morning, a statement went out. Carefully worded, factual, no drama, no names highlighted, just accountability. The press picked it up anyway. They always did. They found the story between the lines. A black woman, a private jet, a pilot removed, a powerful client questioned. The narrative wrote itself for those who wanted to see it. Margaret did not read the headlines. She walked the hangar instead. The aircraft sat where it had been parked overnight, fuel trucks long gone, the tarmac still damp. Up close, the plane looked less imposing. Rivets, seams, signs of use. A machine dependent on thousands of unseen decisions made correctly every day. A mechanic looked up as she approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "Morning," he said, then paused, recognition dawning. "Ma'am." Margaret smiled faintly. "Morning." He hesitated. "Rough night." "Yes," she said, "for everyone." He nodded. "We heard." "I imagine you did." He glanced at the plane. She flew fine. Margaret rested a hand against the cool metal of the fuselage. They usually do. It's the people who make things unpredictable. By afternoon, decisions had been made. Not all of them public. Some would take months. Reviews, hearings, quiet exits, training programs rewritten from the ground up. Emily received a call before sunset. An offer, not a promotion. An invitation. Margaret made it herself. "I'd like you to help redesign cabin training," Margaret said. "Not procedures, judgment." Emily blinked. "Me?" "You were the one who filed the report," Margaret said, "before you knew who I was." Emily laughed once, disbelieving, then stopped. "I don't know if I'm ready." Margaret's expression softened. "Neither was I, the first time someone handed me responsibility." Emily nodded slowly. Then, yes. That evening, Margaret returned to her hotel. The room was quiet, too quiet. She stood at the window, watching the city lights blink on one by one like signals. Her phone buzzed. A message from an old colleague. Short, direct. "Proud of you." Margaret typed back just 2 words. "Still working." She sat at the small desk and opened her notebook, flipped past the earlier pages. On a fresh sheet, she wrote a single line. "Power should never have to announce itself." She closed the book. Outside, planes rose into the night sky, each one carrying people who trusted unseen systems to hold them. Margaret understood that trust better than most. It had to be earned, every time, and she intended to make sure it was. The board convened 2 days later. Not in a glass tower or a hotel ballroom, but in a quiet room adjacent to the hangar, where the smell of fuel still lingered faintly in the air and the windows looked directly onto the runway. Margaret Lewis had chosen the location deliberately. Decisions about flight should be made where flight actually happened. She arrived early, as she always did, carrying nothing but her notebook and a thin folder. No entourage, no assistants hovering. The room filled slowly. Men and women in tailored suits, some graying, some sharp-eyed and young, all carrying the faint tension of people who knew this meeting mattered more than the agenda suggested. At the far end of the table sat a representative from the Aviation Authority, his posture rigid, his expression neutral. Next to him, legal counsel quietly organized documents. No one spoke until Margaret took her seat. She did not call the meeting to order. She simply looked around the table, meeting each set of eyes in turn. The silence did the rest. "We are not here to discuss one pilot," she said at last. Her voice was calm, unhurried. "We are here to discuss a pattern." A few heads nodded, others stiffened. She opened the folder and slid a single page across the table. It was not dramatic, no photos, no highlighted passages. Just timestamps and short descriptions. Displaced passenger, improper override, crew report dismissed, alcohol service deviation. Each line was small. Together, they were devastating. "These incidents spanned 5 years," Margaret continued. "Different aircraft, different crews, same outcomes." One of the board members cleared his throat. "With respect, Margaret, this company has an excellent safety record." Margaret turned to him. "So did every institution that failed right before it did." No one interrupted her after that. She stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind her back, looking out at the runway. A jet rolled past slowly, sunlight flashing along its fuselage. "When systems work, they're invisible," she said. "When they don't, people get hurt. Not always physically. Sometimes it's quieter. Reputation, dignity, trust." She turned back to the table. "We lost all 3 on that flight." The authority representative spoke then, measured and careful. "The captain's license review is underway. Findings will be released in due course." "I'm aware," Margaret said. "This meeting is not about punishment. It's about prevention." She sat again. "Effective immediately, cabin crew authority is being clarified. No pilot will override a documented safety concern raised by senior cabin staff without independent review. Alcohol service policies will be enforced uniformly, regardless of client status. And incident reporting will bypass local management when thresholds are met." A pause. "And," she added, "any passenger who attempts to leverage personal relationships to circumvent protocol will be flagged. Permanently." That last word settled heavily. One board member shifted uncomfortably. "That may cost us clients." Margaret met his gaze. "If they require favoritism to behave safely, they are not clients we should keep." The vote was swift, not unanimous, but decisive. Afterward, as the room emptied, Emily Parker lingered in the doorway. She had not been invited to the board meeting, but Margaret had asked her to attend as an observer, not to speak, to watch. Emily approached hesitantly. "They listened to you." Margaret gathered her papers. "They listened to evidence." Emily hesitated. "I keep thinking about that night, about how fast everything turned." Margaret nodded. "It always feels fast when the truth surfaces. In reality, it's been building for years." Emily swallowed. "Do you ever get tired of having to be the one who notices?" Margaret paused, considering. "Yes," she said, "but I get more tired of pretending not to." That evening, news broke quietly. No headlines screamed, No faces splashed across screens. Just a regulatory notice buried in the business section. License under review. Operator policies revised. Investigation ongoing. Thomas Grant read it alone in his apartment, the city dark beyond his windows. His phone buzzed with messages he did not answer. He poured himself a drink, then set it down untouched. For the first time in a long while, there was no one to call who could fix this. Across the city, Captain Whitmore sat in a small rented room near the airport, uniform folded neatly on the chair. He stared at the wall, replaying every decision. Not the confrontation, not the shouting. The earlier moments. The casual dismissals. The times he had chosen ease over correctness. He understood now that the night on the plane had not ruined him. It had revealed him. Back at the hangar, Margaret walked alone beneath the wing of the aircraft, now silent and grounded. The metal was cool under her hand. She felt the weight of what she had set in motion. Systems resisted change. People did too. Her phone rang. "Margaret?" Emily's voice said, tentative but excited. "Training wants to start next week." Margaret smiled faintly. "Good. I'll sit in on the first session. You don't have to." "I know," Margaret said. "I want to." She ended the call and looked up at the sky, streaked now with late afternoon light. Planes rose and fell in steady rhythm, controlled, accountable. For the first time since the flight, Margaret allowed herself a long breath. This was not victory. It was responsibility, and she intended to carry it. 6 weeks passed before the first real change could be felt. Not announced, not celebrated. It showed up in smaller ways. A different tone in briefings. A pause before decisions that used to be automatic. Questions asked where silence had once been rewarded. Margaret Lewis noticed it the morning she boarded another aircraft from the same hangar. No cameras, no press, no special handling. Just a routine pre-flight, the smell of fresh coffee, the low murmur of crew voices carrying down the aisle. She stopped just inside the door, letting the moment settle, watching the way the crew interacted when they did not realize who was standing behind them. Emily Parker stood near the galley, tablet in hand, running through assignments. Her posture was different now. Straighter, not rigid. Grounded. "Let's keep eyes open today," Emily said quietly to the teen. "If something feels off, we flag it early. No shortcuts." A younger attendant nodded. "Even if the client pushes back?" Emily didn't hesitate. Especially then. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief. Recognition. She moved down the aisle and took a seat that was not 1A. She did it deliberately. Watched to see if anyone noticed. No one did, or if they did, they didn't react. That mattered. The plane lifted smoothly into a clear morning sky. Sunlight cut across the cabin in clean lines. For the first time in weeks, Margaret allowed herself to simply be a passenger, listening to the steady cadence of flight, feeling the familiar pull of altitude settle into her bones. Her phone buzzed once, a message from legal. Short. Final. License revoked. She closed the phone and rested it face down on the tray. The decision had been expected, necessary. Still, she felt the weight of it. Careers ended rarely made noise at the moment of impact. The sound came later, in the quiet spaces where people sat alone with what they had done. Thomas Grant learned that the same way. He sat across from his attorney in a low-ceilinged office that smelled faintly of old paper and expensive cologne. The city hummed outside the window, distant and unconcerned. "This is not negotiable," the attorney said, tapping a document with one finger. "Your flight privileges are revoked. Multiple operators have shared notes." Grant leaned back, hands pressed to his temples. "I've flown with them for years." "That's part of the problem," the attorney said gently. "You relied on that." Grant laughed once, brittle. She planned this. No, the attorney replied. She documented it. The difference hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Grant said nothing more. Back in London, Margaret walked through a training facility that had not existed 2 months earlier. White walls, simple chairs, no polished wood, no executive portraits. On the wall at the front of the room hung a single sentence, printed in black. Authority follows accountability. Emily stood beside it, explaining a scenario to a small group of attendants and flight officers. Her voice was steady, confident without arrogance. "What do you do," she asked, "when someone with influence tells you to ignore your training?" A hand went up. "You document. And? You escalate. And if escalation feels uncomfortable?" Emily paused. "Then it's probably necessary." Margaret watched from the back of the room, unseen. She saw younger crew members leaning forward, engaged. She saw older ones nodding slowly, thoughtful. Culture did not change with speeches. It changed when people felt protected doing the right thing. After the session, Emily found her. "I didn't see you come in," Emily said, smiling. "That's the point," Margaret replied. They walked together down the corridor. The building was quiet now, the hum of activity fading behind them. "Do you ever think about that night?" Emily asked. "About how close it came to going worse?" Margaret nodded. "Every system fails at its weakest assumption." Emily considered that. And what was ours? "That authority would self-correct," Margaret said. "It doesn't. It has to be checked." They reached the exit. Outside, a jet taxied slowly, engines whispering. Emily hesitated. "I used to think standing up meant being loud." Margaret smiled faintly. "Most people do. Real standing up is quieter, harder to dismiss." That afternoon, Margaret met with a group of investors, not to reassure them, to be clear. "We are not chasing growth," she said, hands folded on the table. "We are stabilizing trust. That takes time." One man frowned. "Markets don't wait." "Neither do consequences," Margaret replied. The room went still. Later, alone in her hotel room, Margaret opened her notebook again. She flipped back through the pages, through notes scribbled during the flight, through names and times and decisions that had shifted an entire organization. She stopped at the first page. Time, names, decision. She drew a line beneath it and wrote one more sentence. Systems change when someone refuses to look away. She closed the book and set it on the nightstand. Outside, planes crossed the night sky in silent arcs, lights blinking against the dark. Each one carried people who trusted rules they would never read, processes they would never see. Margaret lay back and stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of engines. The work was not finished, but for the first time since the restraints had snapped closed around her wrists, she felt something close to peace. Not because the story had ended, because it had finally begun to matter. The hangar smelled different after the paint dried. Not the sharp chemical bite it used to have, but something cleaner, almost neutral. Like a room that had finally been aired out after too many closed-door conversations. Margaret Lewis stood a few steps back from the aircraft, hands in the pockets of her coat, studying it in silence. The fuselage caught the morning light in a way it never had before. Darker now, understated. The old branding stripped away without ceremony. No slogans, no promises painted large enough to hide behind. Just a name rendered small and precise near the forward door, visible only if you were looking for it. North Star. Around her, people moved with purpose. Not the rushed kind, the deliberate kind. Mechanics finishing checks. Ground staff exchanging quiet nods. A pilot walking the length of the wing with a tablet, pausing, tapping notes, moving on. No one performed for her. That was the point. Emily Parker approached from the side, her stride confident, her uniform crisp but unadorned. She had the look of someone who knew exactly where she was supposed to be and why. "Pre-flight is clean," she said. "Crew's ready." Margaret nodded. "Any concerns?" Emily considered for a moment, then shook her head. "Not today." They stood together, watching as the stairs were positioned. A small group of passengers waited nearby, coats folded over arms, voices low. No one demanded anything. No one expected to be recognized. Margaret turned toward the plane. "Let's go." Inside, the cabin felt familiar but altered. Same layout, same materials, different energy. The lighting was softer, the aisles clear. Margaret moved down the center, past rows of seats that no longer seemed to announce status by proximity alone. She chose a seat midway back, unremarkable, and sat. The leather creaked softly under her weight. She rested her hands on her knees and listened. There was a sound she had learned to value. The sound of systems working without friction, of people doing their jobs without fear of someone else's ego colliding with them. Emily's voice came over the cabin, calm and even, delivering the safety briefing with a cadence that invited attention rather than demanded it. Margaret watched faces as people listened. Some nodded, some stared ahead. No one rolled their eyes. In the cockpit, the new captain completed his checklist with his first officer. No jokes, no bravado, just routine. Margaret felt the plane respond as the engines spooled, the familiar vibration settling into something steady and reassuring. As they taxied, Margaret looked out the window at the hangar receding behind them. She thought of the first night after the flight, sitting alone with the ache still in her wrists, wondering how much of what had happened was personal and how much was structural. She had her answer now. It had never been about her seat or her clothes, or even the pilot who had believed command meant immunity. It had been about permission. Who had it, who assumed it, who was granted it quietly while others were expected to accept its consequences. The plane lifted smoothly, the ground falling away. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, letting the sensation anchor her. Flight had always been a reminder that control was conditional, that gravity was patient, that systems only held when every part respected the others. At altitude, the cabin settled into its rhythm. Emily moved through the aisle, checking on passengers, her presence unforced. A man near the window thanked her for the smooth takeoff. She smiled and nodded, already moving on. Margaret took out her notebook for the last time. The pages were filled now, not with strategy or timelines, but with observations, small moments, decisions made when no one thought they mattered. She flipped to the final blank page and wrote slowly, deliberately. Power is revealed in how we treat people when we think it costs us nothing. She closed the notebook and placed it back in her bag. She would not need it again. The flight passed without incident. No raised voices, no confrontations, no small humiliations brushed aside as necessary. Just people moving through space together, trusting the structure around them. When they landed, there was no waiting crowd, no officials, no statements prepared. The plane taxied to the gate, engines winding down, and passengers gathered their belongings. Margaret remained seated, letting the aisle clear. She watched Emily help an older woman with her bag, watched the captain step out to greet the crew with a quiet word of thanks. Emily returned to Margaret's row last. "Welcome back," she said softly. Margaret smiled. "It's good to be just another passenger." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "It's good to work somewhere that means it." Margaret stood and followed the others off the plane, blending into the flow. In the terminal, life moved on. Screens flashed arrivals and departures. People hugged, people hurried. No one knew what had changed, and that was fine. The best systems rarely announced themselves. Outside, Margaret paused for a moment, breathing in the cool air, listening to the distant sound of engines lifting into the sky. She felt no triumph, no need to revisit what had been taken or given back. Only a steady sense of alignment, of something set right enough to hold. Stories like this were often told as victories or punishments. She had learned they were neither. They were reminders of vigilance, of responsibility, of the quiet work required to keep power from rotting the structures it rested on. She walked toward the exit, coat buttoned, steps unhurried, leaving behind an industry that would keep flying long after her name faded from memory. That was how it should be. If this story resonated with you, show your support with a like. Subscribe for more stories like this, and share your thoughts below by commenting these 3 words: respect over ego.